let's talk about data attributes. You remember when I went through this example that we found the need for some data attributes, and I put some under product, I put some under payment, and if we had taken more time, I would have put some under customer and outlet and salesperson as well. So how do I know where to put this stuff when I find the need for data? Couldn't I just have a big box and put everything there? You know the answer. The answer is no, we can't do that. So there are some very specific rules that we need to follow as analysts regarding the identification and the attribution of data to objects. So let's talk about data attribution for a moment. So what is this thing called data attribution? And as an analyst, why would I care? Well, data attribution is really just a simple process of finding the right home for the data that we need, but only finding one home for it, not a little bit here and a little bit there and a little bit somewhere else. And what it allows us to do is to eliminate any redundancy in data and therefore potential inconsistencies. Now, as an analyst, you need to be able to do this with transparency. And it truly is very, very easy to do. And why do you care? Rather than just having one big bucket and put all the data into the bucket and say, I'll get what I need out of that bucket, well, you care because you want to have really well-partitioned objects so you can have better focused, very, very targeted objects to use in your business rules table. Remember the business rules table? Let's go over here for a moment. And the business rules table, you put each of the objects that you identify into this table, and then we ask very, very specific focused questions in the context of the process that we're talking about. So how do we identify the objects? So as we can have good, clear objects that we put into the table? Well, I'm going to tell you. There are 6 really, really easy rules. And I'm going to tell you about those 6 rules, starting with, of course, rule number 1. We call it rule number 1 because it truly is the most important rule of all. And that is, attribute the data that you find that you need to the object that it best describes and to no other object. So for example, if you have a payment date of a payment you received from a customer, well, that would describe payment. It wouldn't describe customer. So we would allocate it or attribute it to payment. A customer's email address would partially describe the customer, and we'd attribute it there. So we find the item that we need, and we attribute it to the object that best describes and nowhere else. So if we have a payment amount, for example, and we attribute it to payment, it'll show up under payment and absolutely nowhere else. And that's the first rule. It's a very, very easy rule. Rule number 2 is even easier because you really don't have to do very much, and that is every object that you identify has to have a unique identifier. And that unique identifier is not data. All it is a unique identifier. So for a product, for example, you make a unique identifier which uses the name of the object and just add ID, product ID. Payment as an object, your unique identifier would be the name of the object and just add ID, payment ID. Customer would be customer ID. It's very simple. All it is just a reference point or a key, as some people would call it. And that enables us to refer to the different objects. For example, if I know who the customer is, and I want to find the products that that customer has bought, I need to be able to have what we call a foreign key, which is a reference to the unique identifier of another object inside customer. So if I want to be able to connect the customer record to the product or the products that the customer has bought, I would have product ID, which is the unique identifier of the product, and I would have that as a foreign key or a reference point to that other object inside this object called customer. And because there may be several products that are purchased by the customer, I would put product ID pointing to the product, and I put MV behind it, meaning multi-valued. Now, multi-valued, or MV, means that there's a variable number of instances or occurrences. So when I go to the customer, Harry Schultz, and I want to find out the products that Harry has bought, I can just point to the product record or the multiple product records of all the different products that Harry has bought over time, and I would just put product ID and MV behind it, meaning multi-value. It could be several. So it's very, very straightforward. You can read about the details of this, of course, in your Mastering Business Systems Analysis textbook, but it's very straightforward. Every object has a unique identifier. Take the name of the object, add ID, and that's all there's to it, really. Rule number 3 is, again, very, very easy to deal with. Every object that you identify has to be able to participate in more than one business process, but not necessarily in just in the project you're working on. It could be somewhere else in the organization. And that's because an object has a life cycle. You know, we create a record for a customer, for example. We create a record for a payment. If we create it, we should also be viewing it at some point. And of course, we may change customer information at some point too. And of course, it may be retired. It doesn't mean we delete it, but it means that we check it off as done or retired. So there are those 4 things that happen to an object. Well, if we create a payment record, somewhere else we've got to access it. And here, in this example, we have the customer orders a product. So we receive the customer order, we get the payment from the customer here. And then this one here, it's a different process. The customer returns a product. So we receive the return product, and we keep track of the payment refund that's been. Got to be referred to in more than one place. Otherwise, something's missing. And we're going to talk again about that a little bit later on. Let's talk about rule number 4 for a moment. Every object has to have 2 or more data attributes other than the unique identifier, okay? Because the unique identifier, you'll remember, is not data. It's just a unique identifier. It's an address, in effect. So it has to have 2 or more data attributes. If it doesn't have 2 data attributes or more, then it's just a data attribute. It can't be an object. So where does this stuff come from? Well, we can have data that's part of an object in a normal data set. For example, we can have a customer, or let's say a supplier in this case, and we'd have a supplier address, we'd have contact information, telephone information, email information, a whole lot of other stuff. Or we can derive data from the actual process itself. If you look at this process here, the event is it's time to order a product from a supplier. And we identify the fact that it's time to order a product from a supplier because the product quantity on hand has gone down to some kind of a threshold, some kind of a reorder threshold for a specific outlet in this particular case. So when we know that the quantity on hand needs to be replenished under whatever rules are for that, we know who the supplier is and we know this outlet it has to be shipped to. So let's say then that we have a dialogue with the supplier and we ask for 100 widgets to be delivered by a week Friday. And let's say that the supplier says, I can't give you 100 widgets by a week Friday. What I can do is I can give you 50 by a week Friday, and I can give you another 50 by the end of the month. We say, okay, that's fine. So what we'll do is we'll create a purchase order, keep track of the purchase order, and we'll keep track of the quantity that's ordered. We have one purchase order for 50, and we have another for another 50 with expected delivery dates of a week Friday, and for the other one for the end of the month. And we have some payment terms as well. Now consider other information that you need. You need other information such as, for the purchase order, such as who's the supplier. Well, we can't attribute the supplier contact information to the purchase order because rule number 1 says attribute the data items to the object it best describes and to no other object. And we've already attributed that to supplier over here. Supplier has information about which supplier, where they're located, who to contact, and so forth. So we can't have it here with supplier and here. So what do? Well, we simply have a foreign key or a reference to another object that for this purchase order points to the supplier that it's going to be connected to, joined to, and therefore sent to. In terms of the product that's being ordered, again, we have product information here under the object product. Because rule number 1 says put the data in one place and only in one place. So all the product information is here. Therefore, we can't put it here also because that would violate rule number 1. And what we do is we have a foreign key, product ID, which just points to the product that's being ordered for the specific purchase order. You see how that works. And then we send the purchase order to the supplier and keep track of our own. So it's pretty straightforward in terms of where do we get this stuff. And as long as we point to where the data is and we don't duplicate or replicate data in more than one place. Remember rule number 1, attribute the data item that you need to the object that it describes best and to no other object whatsoever. Let's go on to rule number 5. As an analyst, you've got to remember this stuff. Now, it just takes a little bit of practice, and you do have reference materials. You can keep coming back to this video, or you can come back to the textbook and read about it. Rule number 5 says sometimes we have to have different views of data, but some of those views can be common across several views. So the rule says that any data item that's common to all of what we call subtypes of an object must be attributed to its supertype. So let's see what that really means. Here we have a process. The event is a position that's become available. The process has found candidates for the position. And let's say that we have different candidates that might fit the position. But some of them are full-time employees, some of them are part-time employees, and some of them are contract employees. And some of the data for contract, part-time, and full-time is different than the others. Therefore, we've partitioned each of them and make sure only the data that describes contract is allocated to or attributed to contract, only the data that's definitive of part-time is actually attributed to part-time, but certain information, such as employee name, such as employee address, such as employee contact information, is common to all of the different kinds of employees that has some data that distinguishes them. So we have certain information, such as name, which is common, and we attribute that common information to what we call a supertype. So supertype here would be employee, and the subtypes would be the different kinds of employees, and there would be different data to define those with all the common data in one object, in this case called employee. And so, let me bring that again. So any data item that's common to all the subtypes must be attributed to that object's supertype. And that's rule number 1, really. You just stated it in a different way. Attribute the data item to one object, and only one object, the one it describes best, and to no other object. Here we have the second part of this rule, the flip side of it, if you like, and it says that any data item that is attributed to one of the subtypes, so to contract employee, for example, so any data item that's attributed to one subtype can't be attributed to any other subtype. In other words, you can only attribute to one object, not to several objects. Now that really is just rule number 6 all over again. It's rule number 1, I should say, all over again. And that is attribute the data item to one object only, the one it best describes, and to no other object. So rule number 1 seems to be getting very, very important here. Let's go on to rule number 6. Now, rule number 6 sounds complicated. It's not. We're going to look at it in a second. Is my favorite rule because it shows up so often on different projects. This is the one that we always find that we're encountering in real projects. And rule number 6 says, and I'm going to show you what this wording means in a moment, when a repeating group of related data, a repeating group means a group is 2 or more data items, and all that data is related. Repeating means it must be multi-valued, or there must be several instances of that group of data. When you find a repeating group of related data in an object that you've previously defined, create a new object from the repeating group that you've found. So let's take a look at what this could mean here. Here we have the event is a customer pays for a video. The process is receiving payment. So we get the payment from the customer, and this is renting out videos now. Excuse me. And we get the payment from the customer based on the rental price of the video. As we get the payment, we'll reduce the inventory, of course, and we'll keep track of that payment that we get from the customer. We also keep track of the customer. But let's say that we have a customer that visits us fairly often to rent these videos, and this customer, we have name, address, or account number, and so forth. They pay us with different credit cards at different times. For example, one day they might pay with Visa, the next day they might pay with MasterCard, the next day they might pay with American Express, and so on. So we have here the credit card type, and it says multi-value. MV is multi-value, which means that it could be several of those cards that are being used. And we have a credit card number. So for each of the card types, we'll have a credit card number, one for Visa, one for MasterCard, and so forth. And it says multi-value. And we have an expiration date as well for each card. And it says multi-values because each card has a own expiration date. So here we find then that this is related data, credit card type, number, and expiration date, and it's multi-value, which means it's what I call a repeating group. The other interesting thing about it is that when we first discovered this, we attributed these data items to customer because it felt that it seemed to make sense, and that happens sometimes on projects. That the customer pays with credit cards, therefore it's the customer's credit card. Seems to make sense. But we found out that we have this repeating group. Rule number 6 says, if you find this repeating group, bring it out of the original object and create a new separate object. So we're going to do that. We're going to take these data items, the ones in red here, about the credit card information only, and we're going to create a new object, and I'm going to call it credit card. So now, instead of receive payment looking like this, it now looks like this, and we've added credit card here. And notice that I've taken all that credit card information, this over here, which is multi-value behind it, and D. I've taken it away from customer, I've moved it over to credit card, and I've removed the notation multi-value, because now we'll have one credit card record, if you like. For Visa, we'll have one for MasterCard, we'll have one for Discovery card, and one for Amex, or whatever the combination is. And for each one, we identify the type, we identify the number of the card, and we identify the expiration date of each one. So why do we do this? Because we can now ask clear and concise questions in the business rules table about the relationship between credit card and other forms of payment, between credit card and the customer, and so on. And it allows us to dig deeper, and we'll get better questions and therefore better answers, because when we originally had that information as part of customer, we were asking questions in the business rules table about customer, and yet buried inside it, hiding inside the customer object, was credit card information. So we asked about the customer, and I'm sure there would be qualifiers from our subject matter experts sometimes. where they said something to the customer, then they qualified and say, well, yeah, but there are different rules for credit cards, for example. So it gets fuzzy in a real hurry. So we break it out, create a new object from it, and we can ask clear and concise questions now, because a business might have different rules about these different credit cards. So there you have the 6 rules. And you'll notice that the 6 rules, if we look at a summary of the 6 rules, attribute the data item to the object that best describes and to another object is the first one, and it is a fantastically powerful rule. Start with that and get used to the other rules. And you're going to find that this sounds like 6 rules, sounds like a lot. It's more than on one hand, but rule number 1 is the most powerful of all.